Very well. So, I was hoping for a palate cleanser.
CW48.
Hey, how are you?
Should go say hello.
Amy's on her iPhone. Dr. Green, good evening. Nice to see you. Alex.
I had you on mute.
Hey, how you doing?
Busy setting up my
Michael. Alex. Look at the Ames is in a backyard somewhere.
She's in my backyard.
Where are you?
She's in my backyard.
You look like you're in the Sierras or something.
Me?
No, Amy's with her beanie and her scarf.
Oh, yeah, she does.
Maybe we've been doing this like 602, 603. I would say we've been sticking to the 602, 603 thing. So 60 seconds away. I was thinking, it's echoing to me.
I don't know where that is.
All right. So there are a couple of firsts here, guys. I'm going to give you a little bit of preface to this. There are, I think, a couple of firsts, or a few firsts. One of them is, this is going to be quite, quote unquote, I think I used the word intimate in correspondence this afternoon. Compared to the Saturday wine thing, if any of you have joined any of those, this is intimate. I think we're going to be 18 or 20 or something like that here for this. Hi, Christian. Hello. Another aspect of this is that this is the first, I don't know what we would call it, part of the Saturday wine program. This is the first event that is, I was tempted to say co-hosted, but co-hosted is not exactly accurate. We're joined by Neal. Hello, Neal.
Hi there.
Nice to see you. We're joined by Neal this evening, which is a first for us to do a sort of, co-hosting situation. And then the other thing that occurred to me this afternoon is Chris and I pulled the cork on both of these bottles, the Mouton and Valosier. This is, I guess we haven't really had a tasting yet. People didn't have the wines in front of them, so that's a sort of a consistent thing. I wonder if there's Kevin. Great. Maybe we are now at least approaching completeness at 6:03, and we will get going. Mark, Michael, the Echo, Chris, Bill Franklin.
Okay.
Sorry about the echo, guys. It's on our end, and we are about to fix it. Hello, George. Good evening.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to have you. It's so nice to see you. Okay, so now I think we're complete. I referred to this earlier. Hello, Todd.
Hey, how's it going?
How you doing? Good to see you.
Well, thanks.
I was referring to this earlier as Hollywood Squares. You know, it's or something like that. Can you shut down?
I am trying to, yeah.
Can you see? Okay. Oh, that's much better. That's great. Yep, I think the echo is gone. Does everybody agree? No more echo? Okay. In any case, thank you so much for waiting, for being patient. I was joking when we did our first or second one of these that it would be a good idea for me to maybe rehearse a joke or two to start these things, because you don't want to start it and, for instance, offer very, very salient information in the early going about, the background of the domain or your sense of the wine over the years. You don't want to get into that stuff and then have people walk in at 6:04 and, be, in the woods. The first thing is, thank you immensely for taking the plunge on this with us. Those of you who have been to a Saturday wine or not, this is a first for us in the sense that we have been presenting wines for these Saturday events that are not, all of these wines that we're dealing with are somewhat rare. but we are moving into a different territory here in this tasting that we're doing this evening. Obviously, the wines are a little bit more expensive than the wines that we've been working with for Saturday Wine. They are also wines, these two wines are wines of a different pedigree than the wines that we have been featuring for the Saturday Wine program to this point. I am going to say just a couple of quick things by way of my sense of introduction, and then I am going to give way very, very quickly to Neal because he knows, only just a little bit more about the domain and about the terroir. About all of this, everything that's within the context of this. I'm going to hand it off, after a minute and a half or so after I just give my 2 cents of it. I have, spent the last couple of days, as I do before we get into these tastings, thinking about what in particular, what is the most salient thing for me about some of these wines that we're working with. And the thing that came to my mind, and that I was thinking about actually about an hour ago, I went out and took a walk and I was thinking about this, is that there sometimes seems in the wine world to me to be a correspondence, some kind of correlation between wines that are somewhat under the radar. Cornu is not a Burgundy name that, that gets the alpha collectors excited. It hasn't, Cornu wines have never been a part of that pantheon of the growers that are, lusted after and they're collector's items and the prices go through the roof. They've never been, part of that thing. And the deeper that I get in the wine world, the more it occurs to me that the growers that never get to that place are perhaps the greatest growers of all. Their wines are, for whatever reason, and Neal, I'm sure will speak to this, something about idiosyncrasy, something about a purity of focus or a fearlessness or something like that. They're not interested in producing the wines that are going to seem, perfect to everybody on the face of it. They don't go down that path. Cornu is a grower that has seemed that way to me for, I think I started buying these wines in 2005 or 2006, something like that. The wines from the very beginning have always seemed to me to have a kind of rusticity to them. They have astonishing complexity, especially when you begin to consider the prices that the wines are offered for. Something that I have only learned about a little bit in the last few years is this particular slice of land in Burgundy, which might be referred to as the northern part of the Côte de Beaune. Right, so just south of Nuits-Saint-Georges in the Côte de Nuits, you have this giant hill, which is called the Hill of Cortonne, and the terroir around the Hill of Cortonne is its own distinct thing. Neal works with a couple of different, very, very eminent growers in this part of the world. One of them is Cornu. The other one that springs immediately to mind is the grower Domaine Roland. Roland is making wines in Pernon Vergelès, just off a little bit to the western side of the Hill of Cortonne, and these two wines are coming a little bit from the eastern side of the Hill of Cortonne. I think that's probably, about it for me. They represent wines of an almost kind of animalistic. They're wild and they're spectacular, and they are still, as is evidenced by the fact that we were to get you, all of you, a pair of Valosier and Moutot from what I regard as a very, very good and underrated vintage. It's already 7 years old. Is just I think is a great gift to be able to open two wines like this in 2020 in a moment like this, no less. And that's all I'm going to say. Neal, it's all yours. I hope you have something left. I think your audio is maybe.
My audio is on. Yeah. Matt's introduction has left me with about 3 weeks worth of a lecture to give, and I'm only going to take a few minutes, but boy, you've laid out a lot of subjects here, one relating to the domain itself, the others relating to this particular part of Burgundy that is a favorite part of mine, my history, and from a gustatory sense offers really remarkable interest. And then he's left the subject of why the market dynamic occurs in a certain way with certain wines, certain appellations, certain domains. I mean, there's an enormous amount of ground to cover here. Let me give you just a quick background. Matt has been buying these wines, I guess he said, since about 2005, 2006. I've been buying the wines from Cornu since 1978, which gives it a little bit more perspective. This year, I met the Cornus in 1981, so 2020 will be the 40th year of our relationship. They are one of an elite group of about 30 or so that formed the core of my portfolio when I started building this in the late 70s, early 80s. And I am very fond of the family, and we've gone through a very exciting run over the last 40 years. And I can tell you the very beginning here, Matt has referred to a critical point from a point of view of terroir, which of course is my particular obsession. This, the village of La Dois is where the Cornu domain is located. Most people don't know about La Dois. When I first showed up at the doorstep of Edmond Cornu, the father of Pierre, who is the current grower and whose name is on the bottle occasionally, and still he honors his dad with his dad's name there. But when I met Edmond, one of my favorite wines in the first tasting was a wine that came from the village of La Dois. It bore the label Côte de Bon Village. And I had said to Monsieur Cornu at that time that was of little interest to me, because with my obsession of terroir, the Côte de Bon Village was too broad a designation, because all that means is it was a wine that came from any of the villages along this particular part of the Côte d'Or. And I argued for putting the name La Dois on the label, and he said to me, Monsieur Rosenthal, nobody knows about La Dois. It would be irrelevant. Nobody cares. And so the only way we can commercially make this wine viable is to call it Côte de Bon Village. Well, I stamped my feet as a typical New Yorker would, and kept at it. And we then made a compromise to call the wine La Dois Côte de Bon Village. And then 1 or 2 years later after that, we dropped the Côte de Bon Village, and it's been La Dois ever since. So to get to the two wines in front of us tonight, they both bear the appellation of Allos Corton, which is the village that is west of La Dois. The Route Nationale cuts in between La Dois and Allos. La Dois on the east, and just to give you another little bit of insight into the vagaries of Burgundy and why some domains, and once again getting to another point that Matt raised, why some domains are less well known than others and less highly regarded. The Domaine Cornu is situated in the village of La Dois. Were it in the more prestigious village of Allos Corton, which of course is known by everybody who cares about Burgundy, I think they would have been recognized early on as one of the great producers. Interestingly, I think some of you may know that the principal name of the villages along the Côte d'Or, they add a second part to the name, a hyphenated name, as it were, which usually refers to the greatest vineyard within that geographical designation. So in the case of Allos, the village of Allos added as its second name Corton, which is the great Grand Cru, the singular, by the way, red Grand Cru in the Côte d'Or. And they become Allos Corton. La Dois, in which 50% of the Corton vineyards exist, is called La Dois Serigny. Serigny being the name of the local train station. So that is the irony and the difficult obstacle that La Dois, the residents of La Dois, face in trying to promote their wine. So over the years, I feel that we were sort of encouraged this recognition of the village of La Dois. La Dois is a very important village for me because it is literally the first village in the Côte de Beaune. And it is a transition village between the Côte de Nuit and the Côte de Beaune. And the vineyards within La Dois frequently have this magical ability to absorb and to bring together in a beautiful combination both the typical black fruits that one finds in the wines of the Côte de Nuit and the red fruits that are more typical of the Côte de Beaune. And I think you're going to see in this little display tonight with these two rather exceptional wines, I think some evidence of that, because the Valosière is in the sweet spot of Allos Corton and is as typical of Allos as any wine I've ever brought into. The La Dois, I mean, the Allos Moutat, the vineyard straddles Allos Corton, the boundary of Allos Corton and La Dois. So you will find that I think the Moutat has a very, very different aspect to it. So I think in tasting the two wines together is a classic. This is a classic science experiment because we have similarities on all points except for the actual lieu dit, which is to say the location of the vineyard. We have the same grower, the same vintage, so we're working under the same viticultural and vinification techniques here. So the only difference here is the lieu dit, which is the designation. One is Les Mutats and one is Valosier. So when you compare those two, I think we'll have a nice active discussion about what that means in the sense of terroir and how they can be so significantly different in structure and in aromatics and in flavor, despite being literally a very brief 5-minute walk one to the other.
Neal, can you say a word or two about your sense of what the Cornu house style has been over the last few decades?
Well, that's an interesting, that is another discourse, Matt, that I'll try and make brief, which is not my strong suit, making things brief. I've had a great experience with the Cornu family. I worked with Edmond, as I said, from the very, very get-go. He was a very, very traditional grower, frequently leaving the stems in his wine, in his Pinot Noir. He would, his élevage, which is to say the time between the fermentation, the actual bottling, frequently extended for 24 months, which was classic at the time that I got started in the late 70s and the early 80s. Now things are done in much more rapid fashion in many places. But those wines are as traditional as they get. I have wines in my cellar from the early 80s from Cornu that one day hopefully we'll all get a chance to taste together. These are, for me, these are the wines I learned on. This is where I became, where I developed my own taste and my own love for great Burgundy. When Pierre comes, this is a typical experience for me. When the next generation takes over, there is an important, I think everybody has this kind of motivation to create their own identity, to place their own mark on whether it's a domain or a business. I did the same thing with my dad in a certain way when I took over his liquor store from my legal career. Everybody wants to say, puff up their chest and say who they are. With Pierre, he came into the domain and worked studiously under his dad, learned all the lessons. You can go to, I've always said the greatest school is to be an apprentice with a great grower. You can go to, the viticultural school in Beaune, which is a very important place to be, but frequently you learn lessons that you shouldn't be learning. So Pierre learned at the foot of his dad.
It's like school.
For me, is one of the greatest growers I've ever worked with. But Pierre also he has a love of experimentation. And over the years, we've come to loggerheads about a couple of things. In fact, I completely skipped the 2007 vintage because I was very disappointed with a decision he had made, which to adapt or adopt a certain new technique that was all the rage in Burgundy at that particular time and was recommended by a multitude of analogs. And I literally refused to buy a vintage of wine from him.
Wow.
Yeah. So believe me, that ended that experiment because it's not a matter of bragging, but we are his most important client. So I think a lesson was learned there. So I do think stylistically, Pierre's wines are slightly more polished than his dad's wines were. I think they're less rustic. They have, this is all relative, obviously. But I do think that Pierre has left a slight degree of velvety quality to the tannins that maybe we didn't see with Edmond, whose wines were a little bit more ferocious, a little bit more difficult to get into early on.
Am I correct in assuming that if you were to deign to recommend a sequence for these two wines, that you would start with Mutot and then?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Mutot if you learn these lessons when you taste in the cellars with the growers. I've had some amusing and wonderful experiences with the growers with their decisions as to what to show first and what to show last and what to put in the middle.
Yeah.
In this instance, the Mutot is always served before the Valosier because it is more welcoming and more gentle.
And somewhat more Côte de Nuit in character.
Well, I think it has elements. I think some of the fruit elements in the Moutot are more. There is a little bit. There's a little touch of the black fruit, whereas the Vallée aux Iers is a perfect representation of what I have come to know and love as Allos Cortone. Allos Cortone, the tannins in Allos Cortone are along with Pommard, represent probably the two appellations in the Côte de Beaune that offer wines with the most rustic, a more aggressive tannin quality that exists in the Côte de Beaune. Many wines from the Côte de Beaune have a more gentle aspect to them.
Then Vallauzière and Pommard.
And Vallauzière and Pommard, absolutely, yeah. Vallauzière has a very dusty, grainy tannin to it.
I think that's what I love about it.
Yeah.
Everybody had a chance to pour some of that Moutot. Is everybody into the Moutot? I don't see a lot of wine glasses out there. I see faces, but everybody's wine glasses are in front of them. Ah, there they are. My goodness, look at that. Wow.
Okay.
Can I interject one question about this?
Wine glasses. Please don't hesitate to ask questions. I think in this size group, you might as well just blurt it out instead of typing it because we'll hear it. Yeah.
Neal, one question about the style differences. Is it true that they're no longer using whole cluster, that it's all destemmed at this point?
No, it depends really on the vintage. For many years, Pierre did destem 100%. Recently, there is a movement in Burgundy to come back to leaving some of the stems in. And the techniques now and the equipment now allows you to choose, you can do 10%, 15%, 30%. It gives you a lot more flexibility now.
Just dial it up on the machine of how much percentage of stem you want?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's pretty much that. It's, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about the soil differences between these two wines? Because I get much brighter fruit on the Moutot than the other, and I'm just curious how that's driven by the soil.
You've described that perfectly. The soil in Allos Cortone under Vallauzière is much. If you look at the color, it's sort of rust colored. It has a lot of iron in it, and it's a very thin soil with a good deal of clay underneath. And that gives the tannins a little bit more. It gives a more ferocious quality to the tannins. The Moutot is a slightly, I would say, more fruity. I don't like to use the word fruity because I think it's just a banal term. I think you get a sexier aromatic to this at first, and I think it has almost a sweetness to the fruit that makes it more welcoming.
Yeah. It's incredibly seductive. Like I've already had 2 glasses of this, and because I can't stop drinking it.
To be honest with you, to me, these wines are perfect counterpoint. If we're thinking about it in terms of music, this is counterpoint.
Is everybody into the Vallauzière? I wondered how this was going to go, whether people would go side by side or one after another.
I'm wondering if Neal can talk a little bit more about the counterpoint aspects.
Yeah, well, I think each the beauty of Burgundy when it's rendered in this fashion, if you love terroir, Burgundy is the holy grail because the nuances in Burgundy are so vast. The palette, if you're talking about it in terms of painting or in terms of music, as I just did. It is beyond the doctorate level. If you walk the vineyards, the beauty of walking the vineyards with a grower in a village, within a matter of steps, you can see the structure of the soil. You see the color of the soil change, and that is what we're talking about here. We're not talking. The fruit is one thing. But when it gets down to it, and as the wines age, what you're talking about is this: are the hundreds of thousands of years of planetary of geologic movement in a very particular place, and that's what you see expressed in these wines. And that's one of the values of having vineyards that have a lot of old vines in them, because the old vines have a very, very deep root structure, and the roots are searching for nutrients in that minerality that is sometimes 20, 30, 40, 50 feet under the ground, under the surface. So when you talk about the topsoil, which in these places is very, very thin, these are not easy areas to grow a lot of things. You are really talking about this vast spectrum of minerals that find their way into these wines, and you hope that these wines express that. So the counterpoint here is that in Mutut, just because of the slope and literally the elements that one finds within the soil, the subsoil here, are quite different than what one finds in Vallauzière.
Could you talk about?
So Neal, can you talk a little bit about how old these vines
Mark,
are? I mean,
Alex, hold on one second. Mark, what was your question?
No, I was just curious about beyond the terroir and the soil, the elevation or sun exposure between the two. Is there any difference?
Both are similarly exposed, Mark. They are mid-hill. They are both southeast facing. They are so the level of incline and the exposure to the sun are relatively the same. I think the big differences here, and obviously the vinification is the same. The big differences here rest in the soil and the subsoil. They're vastly different. This is one of those domains that it's just a delight to visually explore and texturally explore the soils as you move from one vineyard to the next. The other even more exceptional experience is to go visit Ghislaine Barteau in Chambol, who has 4 vineyards that encircle Bonne Mare. She has no holdings in Bonne Mare, but she has holdings in 4 vineyards that encircle Bonne Mare, and literally in 15 to 20 minutes you can walk from one to the other, and it's just astonishing to see the differences in the soil, the color, the texture. It's breathtaking.
Neal, how far apart are these vineyards?
Oh,
1,000 yards?
Yeah, it's a 5-minute walk. 5-minute walk.
5-minute walk is amazing.
And the Vallauzière is south, and the Mutut is north.
Yeah.
And then Mutut is it crosses the border between Alos and Ladois.
Yeah. What is Alex? Where's Alex Kunsto? There you are. What you have?
I just wanted to know how these are obviously not young vines, but how old are they?
Well, I think the Vallauzière, if I recall correctly, and I should have my notes in front of me, but I don't. I think the Vallauzière is somewhere probably average age of 60 to 65-year-old vines. I think the Mutut is younger. I think the Mutut is a mix of somewhat younger vines, maybe 15, 18 years, and older vines that are 45 to 50 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, when we refer to old vines in Burgundy, most of my growers don't consider vines even old until they get to 30 years. And in fact, for a while at Domaine Fourier in Gevrey-Chambertin, they never bottled anything from vines that were less than 30 years old. They would sell what they consider their young vines. They would sell it off to negociants. That's changed ever since he got famous.
Do you have a sense for, is there anything to be said about whether the wines from these vineyards age in a different way, or?
I think they age in a different way. I think they both age phenomenally well, because the aging process, Matt, is one that really, the point that makes a wine age is the balance in the wine. Structurally, they may be very, very different, but if they're well balanced, they will age exceedingly well. For me, the point of life is this constant search for the perfect equilibrium, whether it be, it can be internally, it can be from a sense of a wine, whether it's in perfect, you're always trying to get perfect balance. We're rarely there, but that's the search. And I think if we have wines, there are vintages here that are not, that because of the climatic conditions may not be as well balanced as others, and they may have a shorter lifespan.
Speaking of which, what is your sense, without having these wines in front of you, what's your sense of 2013 for?
2013 is a very fresh vintage. It's got a lot of nice racy acidity, which I think gives a very bright future to these wines. It's a vintage that I think is less highly regarded because the wine, I'm not going to refer to people as wine writers, because writing is a different process than making up critical scores. That's a whole different discipline. Most people who assess these wines miss the point because they're tasting these wines early on. Everybody wants to be the first one to make a judgment about a particular vintage. And frequently the wines that are heralded as the greatest vintages are those that are the most ripe. In my experience, that does not always make for the greatest vintage. It makes for the most impressive vintage early on because they are more drinkable early on, and you can appreciate them early on because they're so generous and thick and rich, sometimes almost candied. And that is a very attractive feature. I have been in cellars. My traditional habit is to taste the wines for the first time in the late winter, whether it be February, early March. That's when I usually go. That's a very, very difficult time to taste wine. Very difficult time because most of these wines have not finished their malolactic fermentation. And the malolactic and the malic acid, before it turns, it can be just aggressively sharp and almost impossible to taste, make the wines very difficult to taste. So you're just making a preliminary assessment at that point in time. And then you wait until the visit in late summer or early fall to see how these wines are evolving. Now that the malolactics happen, they pass one summer, and you're waiting to see them a second time. And we always taste in Burgundy. We always taste wines at least 3 times before they're bottled, and then we taste again after it's bottled, and that's when we ultimately decide when we're going to ship the wine. In this instance, so I think a vintage like 13 gets overlooked because it's the kind of vintage, if you're tasting it in March of 2014, it's going to be very aggressive, highly acidic, and to some people unpleasant. I like that kind of wine. I think it's something that I grew up on, because when I first started buying wine in Burgundy, one of the greatest gifts that was ever given to me is the fact that I started buying wine in some miserable vintages. And that was a real blessing in disguise. I mean, commercially it was a disaster, but it was a blessing in disguise because I managed to find a group of extraordinary growers that were able to produce good wine in really bad vintages. It made it a lot easier for me. Had I been cruising through looking for my growers over the past dozen years when we've had 1 or 2 mediocre vintages, everybody's able to make a decent wine in a vintage where there's a lot of sun. So, but it gave me, it certainly worked well with my particular palate, which is one that sort of tends to liking wines of very high acidity. So in this case, I think 2013 has this freshness that I like very, very much. It's not a big, thick, jammy wine. These are not going to be that way. I don't think anybody produced wine like that in 2013. But because of this nice high acidity, brisk wine, the brisk kind of feeling I get with these wines, I think these wines will age very, very handsomely for 15 to 20 years.
I do have a question.
Chris George has a question.
I do. Speaking of the 13 vintage, I mean, we move vintage to vintage, and we, get around to loving the, peculiar nature of each individual year. But 13 seems to stand alone, except for maybe 14. And we haven't seen anything quite like 13 since then. And
as far as acidity?
Yeah, absolutely. As far as like the amount of acidity in these wines, so we do have.
Well, I think that, Chris, I think that's the beauty of. That's the joy of my life in this business, because every year is a new phenomenon, and we can make comparisons one year to the next, but they are each unique, and you have to assess them for what they are. I mean, my career has been built on buying wine from my growers every year, not skipping around and just buying vintages that have been well received by the press or whatever. I mean, that was one of the first things that sort of created a difference for me in my career in France and Italy, is that when people realized they could rely on me every year. And I think the key for me is to find a grower who is capable of producing excellent wine. And when they can't produce excellent wine because the vintage is just abominable, they don't bottle it. I mean, I have many instances of that happening. So
Not recently, though.
Pardon me?
Not recently, though.
Well, recently we've been blessed with this. The good thing about climate change is that we've had a lot warmer weather, and people aren't having trouble getting ripe grapes anymore. It's just the opposite, sometimes too ripe.
Well, speaking of which, oh, sorry. I'll let whoever needs
George.
to. Yeah, George.
Go ahead, George.
Go for it.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Neal, one question. So I popped the corks at about 5:30. I didn't decant, and about 7 minutes ago, sorry, I can't remember, the Valisier like just exploded with richness and fruit and totally overtook the Mutot. And I'm just curious your sense of that may be one person's view, but wow, like it went crazy in the last 10 minutes. I'm just curious.
That, yeah. Well, just to make a comment. First of all, these wines are 7 years old, but they're still in their infancy. So that's the first thing. I happen to love decanting wine. I love the ritual of it. But in addition, I think it's a big advantage to enjoying wine. I think I don't care whether wines are young, old. I love decanting wine because I think if you were stuck in a bottle for 2 years or 5 years or 15 years, you'd need some time to air out also. And so I do think it's to a wine's advantage. People have said, well, the fragile old wines don't do well when they're decanting. I'm completely opposed to that view. And I think young wines need it even more. So I would recommend decanting. Certainly opening the wine well in advance is a big advantage with these wines. And I think the aromatics in a wine like the Balosier is sort of an ornery dude, he's not going to be friendly until he gets comfortable around you. So it may take a couple of hours.
Yeah, to be fair, I only didn't decant because I'm moving and my decanters are in boxes, Neal. So you got to cut me some slack, man.
I do a lot of slack already. The fact that you're sitting here enjoying the wines with us is worth the price of admission for me. You bet. Yeah.
Other questions?
Neal, are you seeing much generational change? I mean, I know kind of apocryphally, Burgundy's always been well insulated against sort of, there's that famous Robert Parker story getting, chased out with the dog and never getting to review the wines. But as generations take over and also climate change come in, are you seeing the style of wines change?
I think you've opened up a subject for enormous discussion. And wow, I mean, yeah, there's a ton of change. Each succession generation to generation, there is bound to be change because everybody has the right and the privilege to try and make their individual mark, his or her individual mark. That's one thing. I do think that we've gone through waves of significant change in Burgundy that have sometimes been very, very difficult for me to accept. There's stuff going on now that I find shocking. I find it sad. There are wines in my cellar that you will, by buying wines now, those wines will never be replicated again. Never, ever, ever be replicated again. As soon as people were able to control the temperature mechanically during fermentation, a lot of the mystery of making wine, of producing wine, went out the door. And so those are the wines that I grew up on, and I miss that stuff. So I do think there's a change. Climate change certainly is having a major impact here. In the early days, if we would be thrilled, we'd be smiling if a wine got to 11.5% natural alcohol. Now it's like, holy shit, they've already got 13% alcohol here, and these grapes aren't ripe yet because the rest of the stuff hasn't gotten there. The grapevine has a natural vegetative cycle, so that even though the climate is changing, the rule of thumb is for a grape, generally it's 100 days from flowering when you can, is basically the time around which you will pick. There have been vintages where people have picked grapes after 85 days or 90 days from flowering. And yes, the sugars are high, but the other elements, the pits, the stems, the skins, haven't gotten there yet. And that's what's causing so much dislocation. It's making some of the wines very, very difficult to follow. Some of the wines very, very difficult to accept for me. And it's a real struggle, a real struggle. So we're up against it. And then you have all of the questions about succession now. That the value of the vineyards that we're talking about have gotten so high that growers can no longer afford to buy vineyards. So the next generation, there's no ability to expand production unless you're renting in some sense, and then the rental costs are that much higher, and that's why you're seeing these wines go to stratospheric prices, which is very, very disconcerting to me. I did not get into this business to sell $3,000 a case wine. That's not the joy of it. So yeah, there's a lot going on now, and we're fighting a rearguard action to hope we can hang in there. And
Neal, I mentioned in the couple of things that I said up front, I made a comment or two about my sense of Cornu's place in the market. Can you speak to that at all about where?
I think, yeah. I mean, this is a domain that has pretty much been overlooked for 40 years. I have no trouble selling the wine generally. I certainly sold it. Interestingly, I sold it more successfully when I was less successful, if that makes any sense. Early on in my career, I developed a following for people buying Burgundy, and the Cornu wines would sell easily, from the simplest Bourgogne Rouge through the Choix-les-Beaunes, through the Ladois, up through the Corton Bressant, and I never had any wine left over. Now I have verticals of many of the wines now. I happen to be buying more wine. That's one thing. When I was younger and poor, I could scrape together, I could buy maybe 10 cases of this and 25 cases of that, et cetera. And of course, the prices were a lot less daunting at that period of time. So I think it's a domain that has never really caught the fancy of the public. I think part of it is the style, which is to say that the wines are somewhat severe when they're young. A lot of that is not necessarily the style of the house, but the terroir. You get to appellations like Choix-les-Beaunes and Ladois and Allos Corton. They can be somewhat severe and rigorous early in their development. So I think that takes away from it. Secondly, the appellation of Allos Corton, the area around Allos Corton, has never been a favorite amongst the wine crowd. Much like Nuits Saint-Georges is in the Côte de Nuits, it is recognized as producing great wine, but nobody seems to ever want to drink them. So I think the appellation itself has been skipped over by a lot of the wine press, if you will, and a lot of people don't pay attention to it. I think there's great wine to be found there. You have two of the greatest wines in the Côte de Beaune come from there: Corton Charlemagne on the white side, and Corton, and all the different Corton reds on the red side. So there's really no reason for that. And I think one of the great places to look for value right now is right here. This is when wines from these other appellations have gotten to points of just astronomically high prices, which in my opinion is a disaster for Burgundy and a disaster for the wine drinking public. I think this is an area, just like Pernod Vergelès on the other side that you referred to with Roland, it is an area that we should all be looking at and searching for great wine, because it's there. And it's a little bit under the radar.
I was mentioning to Chris before this got started that there are a lot of growers in your portfolio that I was buying in 2005 and 2006 that the prices that I was paying in 2005 and 2006 were very significantly less than they are now. And Cornu is an example of a grower. I said to Chris, Ladois Corvée was never a $20 wine. Never.
No, it never was. And it doesn't deserve to be a $20 wine.
No, it's a very great wine.
Great wines in my portfolio.
But now it's not that much more expensive than it was 15 or 20 years ago.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So
I mean, look, there are areas that we can absolutely search for value, and they exist primarily in the Côte de Beaune. We're talking about the Côte d'Or, and we're talking about areas like Saint-Aubin or Saint-Romain or Pernod Vergelès and Ladois. Those are villages that have been basically overlooked for whatever reason, and I think there's still those are some of the few areas now where you can find really superior value in Burgundy.
Other questions before we wrap this up for the evening and leave you to your double barrel?
One quick one, if I may.
Please, Dennis.
Neal, you alluded to some of the other bottlings from Cornu, and I was curious if you could give us kind of a quick overview of sort of what some of the village cuvées are like, or I think there's a single Grand Cru in the portfolio.
Yeah. So one thing I want to point out to you is there's a couple of really sensational white wines that nobody ever pays attention to other than me.
Ladois Blanc.
The Ladois Blanc, there's a Ladois Blanc that we get anywhere from 300 to 600 bucks. By the way, before I even get to that, I don't think anybody really realizes the rarity of the two wines in front of you. We're talking about a production here of maybe anywhere between 2 to 4 barrels of each of these wines in any particular vintage. We get sometimes as little as 300 bottles of each of these two wines for the entire United States. Just want to make sure that everybody understands, puts all of this stuff in perspective here. Okay, now we'll pass on to the Ladois Blanc, which is a little I hate to do this kind of thing, it's such a silly cliche, but it's a little baby Corton Charlemagne. It's beautifully situated. It's within the village of Ladois, but it's not terribly far away from the hill of Corton Charlemagne. It's on on the front slope of it, and it's just a brilliant wine that I think offers exceptional value in white Burgundy. And then there's another white that's even less expensive, but certainly less distinguished, from the village of Chory-les-Beaunes, the Chory-les-Beaunes Blanc. Both of those wines are exciting wines for me, and wines that one can easily put in the cellar and save at a very reasonable price. With respect to the village wines, first of all, we start with a Bourgogne Rouge Les Barriques, which is a single vineyard Bourgogne Rouge that straddles the villages of Ladois and Chory-les-Beaunes to the south. That's a lovely little wine that comes in at the baseline here. And then we move into a series of village wines. There's a Savigny-les-Beaunes, which is produced in very, very limited quantities, which is a very silky, cat-like wine with a very, that's a wine that you can jump into pretty much in its youth. And then you've got the Chory-les-Beaunes Les Bons Ors, which is a very rustic red wine with sort of the hard tannins of Allos Corton, usually somewhat lighter in color. It reflects this sort of copper iron kind of infused soil that has a sort of very light pink tint to it. And that's a wine that is sort of a baby sister to Allos Corton. There is an Allos Corton Old Vines cuvee that we bring in as a village level that I think is an outstanding wine and very, very representative of Allos Corton, the character about the terroir of Allos Corton. And my favorite, of course, is the Old Vines Ladois Village, which has this beautiful little touch of the Côte de Nuit in it. And I think those are great wines and just superb value. You know, when people are spending, excuse me, but there's $60, $80, $90 for wines from the Sonoma coast or Oregon or something, and you can get these wines for $30 or $35. It just doesn't make any sense to me that people aren't buying them. And those are the village wines. And then we have a series of Premier Crus, the Ladois Les Corvées. We've got the Ladois Bois Rousseau. We've got Ladois Premier Cru Les Carrières. That's a great run of Ladois Premier Crus and a wonderful way to introduce yourself to the terroir of Ladois, because each of the three of those Premier Crus are each significantly different than the other and have their charm. And then, of course, there's the one Grand Cru in the house, which is the Corton Les Brissantes, which has always been the wine of the domain.
So Caleb would like to ask about the 2014 Corton Les Brissantes for himself in 30 years.
Are you a 2014? You were born in 2014, Caleb?
Yes.
All right, great. Well, since I don't want to disappoint you, I won't tell you that I think that I will tell you that 2014 has its charms. It does have its charms, and I think that Caleb should get started drinking sooner rather than later. I think so. If 2014, I think when he gets to his 20th birthday, why don't we celebrate with that wine when he graduates high school?
Graduates high school. Yeah. It's a great idea.
We graduate high school.
On the other hand, if he were to grab some Corton Charlemagne from 2014.
Well, Corton Charlemagne, yeah, he could take that into his.
The whites, right? 50 years.
He can take that into his when he gives his doctoral dissertation. Okay.
Thank you.
A good prospect for you.
Other questions? Any other questions? It's 6:49. We've been running for 50 minutes. That's, I think, a record for our.
That's quick, isn't it?
No, we tried it. We tried it. Chris and I tried to cut it off at 40 minutes on Saturday Wine because we're afraid that we're going to get into people's dinner hour and keep everything.
I have to tell you, this is not my first Zoom thing that I've done.
It's not.
I've been working overtime lately because everybody wants to do these Zoom things, and some of them just drag on it.
I know it. Who wants to be a part of that?
So everybody here is being so fucking polite.
We're very polite in the Bay Area. I don't know if you know that about us. Yeah. We're a very well-mannered part of the country.
I'm getting the picture. Back in New York, they don't let you go.
They're shouting at you for crying out loud.
But Neal, it's not about politeness. We're actually interested. The New Yorkers don't give a fuck. We actually care.
Neal, I put this in the chat and a few people replied to it, but I just want to say thank you for the way you've approached winemakers with your consistent and long-term relationship. For those of us that are sort of playing along at home and as consumers, it really allows us to follow and see the evolution, right? We'll read about the weather in Burgundy, but this actually lets us compare it from one year to the other.
I think it's been the key to my success, actually, and I think I'm very, very grateful that I adopted that approach early on. It's really made an enormous difference, and I do think it's the joy of following these growers every year. They're endlessly fascinating wines. It's unlike when you're buying, and excuse me for saying this, you're buying a negociant wine, you're buying a house style, which sometimes is purposely transposed into a sort of a formulaic kind of wine. I don't think that's really the idea here. There's a reason there's a vintage on the label.
So thank you for doing that. It's very
Bill
it's wonderful.
Bill Miller, do you have a question? You don't? I saw you light up for a second.
No, I just lit up for a second. I was trying to, I've never been accused of being polite, so I was really, didn't know quite how to counteract that. And I couldn't come up with anything remotely polite to counteract that I'm not polite.
Yeah. Well, Bill has been the beneficiary of one of my Zoom affairs. What was it, last week or 2 weeks ago, Bill? We did this for another occasion.
Matt, maybe you can put together a Cornu box for us from Neal.
We can certainly put together a Cornu box.
That is a great way to buy wine, by the way. I mean, you can sort of replicate this kind of experience of going to the cellar by buying we've got we have well over 12 appellations in the Cornu portfolio. You'd have to buy, if we went to Lignea, you'd have to buy 2 boxes. We have so many appellations.
I can't buy Lignea because I love Kellen, so I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong side of that argument, Neal. But
that'll be a very, very interesting little story to tell at some other.
Well, I would love that because I tasted with Kellen several years ago, but get us a couple cases of the Cornu and through Matt, and we'll buy it, and we want to support Matt and Chris, and that'd be great.
Or you can do what Bill's doing and come along with us one day for a week in Burgundy.
So just you tell me when, and I'll be there.
Okay.
How are we?
Yeah, unfortunately it's not next week when we were scheduled.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's 2 weeks. The 17th we're supposed to be together. We're supposed to be together on the 17th to the 24th of May. That's a shame. So we're going to have to do something for that, Bill. We're going to have to figure out another way to celebrate for the moment, huh?
Yep.
Neal, when you think about these wines, what food do you think about at the same time?
Well, we have a sort of a joke. We've been, when you go to Burgundy, it's not my favorite place to eat. It's a sort of heavy cuisine. And we used to have a joke when we'd be invited to dinner at any particular grower's place in Burgundy. It was de rigueur to have there were certain dishes that were sort of classic Burgundian dishes, and every grower wants to, certainly early on in the relationship, wants to show you the traditional way that they eat and they live. So you'd have œuf murette, which are these poached eggs in a red wine sauce, frequently with pancetta and onions. That certainly works with certain things. The other thing they'd always serve is a jambon persier, which doesn't work with many things. But
What is
I guess the joke ultimately that the only vegetable we ever saw was a cornichon.
What is jambon persier?
Jambon persier is like a pate with there's a you know, the gel of meat. It's a sort of a ham infused with.
It's parsley, right?
Yeah, parsley, exactly, yeah. At any rate, I think of wines like this. First of all, the Alos is a very distinguished wine, and I think a classic, almost any classic dish with fowl works really, really well with this stuff. You know, just a simple roast chicken, or, you know, we go into the Jura and we have wonderful things with chicken and with morels, and that they'll serve with an oxidized white wine. But I can certainly see these wines working with them. And I think any kind of stew, daube, that kind of thing works well with these wines. They have an earthiness to them that stands up to almost anything you could throw at it.
Neal.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much. It's getting late on the East Coast.
Well, it is. Well, it's all in the definition of late, Matt. And it is a Friday, so you know it's not that big of an imposition. This is great fun. I love all of you very much for following Matt and Chris and his team and Amy, because they have been the most extraordinary supporters of ours, great partners. It's really rare to come across people who are so enthusiastic, so knowledgeable, and so willing to share their joy with us and with you. You know, I can't say enough about the relationship that we have with Heirloom Cafe. And you folks for supporting Matt and Chris and Amy in their venture, particularly through this really strange and rather absurd time. I'm thinking of sort of this has got to be part of an Ionesco play for sure. And to me, it's a great privilege for me to be able to be invited to participate in this little play of ours. So it's nice. It's great. Thanks.
Thank you so
Can
much.
I interject one quick question?
Michael,
Matt,
go ahead.
Tomorrow night we're drinking Javier's Condrieu.
Yes.
And Matt has made the point that he doesn't think Condrieu ages very well. And I'm curious about your perspective on Condrieu aging. Very briefly.
Well, I think most Condrieu now doesn't age really well because it's too high in alcohol. I think the wine you're going to be tasting tomorrow, and I may pop in on that little session, is one of the exceptions to the rule. I think Condrieu goes through multiple stages. When I first started buying Condrieu back in 1981 and 82 from Yves Quiron's uncle, Antoine Quiron, those wines were frequently 11.5% alcohol. And they were much more, their joy was in their aromatics. And the wines were light on the palate, they were fresh, and they didn't have the stuffing to age usually. Now we're getting to a point, then we went through this phase where some of the growers in the area were trying to produce late harvest wines that ended up carrying a healthy degree of residual sugar. And so those age in a very different fashion. And I think a well-balanced Condrieu now, depending upon where it is within the appellation, can age well, but I think it transforms itself. It's a little bit of a Jekyll and Hyde kind of experience with Condrieu now. Early on, the wines are more notable for their aromatics, and then they go into a sort of a shell for a while. And when they come out of it, they can be almost Burgundian. But that gets, you know, we'll see. You might see that a little bit tomorrow, actually, because you're doing the 2014, Matt, right?
14 Marmozan.
Yeah. So a 6-year-old Condrieu is sort of an interesting little creature. Yeah. So we may be able to discuss that even at greater length tomorrow night. Yeah. It'll be interesting to hear Xavier's take on that. Of course, he's going to be 3 o'clock in the morning his time. So I'm not sure how lucid he's going to be, but what the heck? Knowing Xavier, he'll probably just be coming back from a party. So he'll probably be okay. All right.
Thank you so much.
To all of you, thanks. Have a wonderful weekend, and let's get this thing over and beyond us.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Neal.
Thank you.
Sign us up for a case of each.
All right. You got it. I want the Cornu case, Matt.
You can just go ahead and